Well, good evening, everyone. I'm David Rubin, the Brown Foundation Curator of Contemporary Art here at SAMA, and I'm so pleased to welcome you and welcome our special guest tonight, Willie Cole. Willie, welcome.
Thank you.
Before we begin, just a reminder to please silence your cell phones. Also, I want to remind you that the exhibition San Antonio Collects Contemporary will be on view through July 1st. And once again, we're very grateful to the Linda Pace Foundation for their support of the exhibition. And two upcoming events I want to mention in our ongoing Artist Conversation series. In July, we always do conversations with artists who have work on view in the permanent collection galleries. And actually, we're going to switch nights for the first one on Friday night, July 6th at 6:30 p.m. I'll be doing a conversation with Jesus Morales. And on Tuesday, July 17th at 6:30 p.m., we'll be doing a conversation with Joey Forso. Both have work currently at the museum. So we hope you'll join us for those events. Okay, let's see if we could lower the house lights a little bit. And as always, Willie, we like to kind of begin by talking about your roots, your background a little bit. So you were born in New Jersey.
Yes, sir. I was born in Somerville, New Jersey.
Tell us a little bit about your parents and your childhood.
Well, my mother was born in New Jersey in a real small town, but my dad migrated from the South to work in the factories. So I was born in '55, and we lived in Bound Brook, New Jersey, a very, very small town. And we moved to the big city of Newark when I was 3 years old. So I grew up mostly in Newark, grammar school, high school in Newark.
And what did your father do for a living? What was the family background?
Well, my father worked at a chemical factory, American Cyanamid. Ironically, their major product was paint. And he worked there as a mechanic, so he fixed all kinds of machines. And he also did a lot of blueprint drawing and reading. So he would give me a lot of graph paper and a lot of pencils from his job. My mother didn't work when I was a kid. She didn't work until I was in high school. And then she became a bank teller, and eventually she retired from the post office as a supervisor.
And was there much encouragement for making art when you were young?
You know, that's an interesting question, because in a way there was. Since I was 3 years old, they always called me the artist, the little artist. So that was a big encouragement, a boost of confidence. If we had visitors, they would always introduce me as, and this is our little artist. So that kind of had me believing I was an artist my whole life. My father was an artist in his own way, because he could take anything apart and put it back together, which is what I do now a lot. And he was also kind of like an amateur Barry Gordy. He did a lot of music recording. He played the harmonica. He had friends come by with guitars, and they would always have jam sessions and make music, and he would record them. He also made a lot of like radio plays. For example, he would record my mother in the kitchen cooking, and then he would mix that with James Brown, and then he would make sound effects. Like his favorite effect was balling up paper to make it sound like fire. So he did a lot of stuff like that. He had a lot of movie equipment when I was a kid as well.
So as you said, you sort of were almost predestined to be an artist, and here are some shots of you early on doing artwork. Tell us about your education and the role of art in that.
Well, going back, as a little kid, I went to art camp every summer in Somerville, New Jersey. My grandmother lived there up through the 70s, and I spent every summer there with her. The Newark Museum also had weekly art classes, so I went there every Saturday since I was about probably 10 years old. And then I went to high school for art. I went to high school for art and music at a school called Arts High School in Newark, which is the country's first high school of the arts. So my high school experience was very much like the movie Fame. We were all like crazy, freaked out, you know, young hippie kids, and we were just.
And this is sort of like the tail end of the 60s?
Yeah, yeah. I was there from 1968 to 1972. And then I went to the School of Visual Arts in New York, but I majored in graphic design, not fine art. And from there, I went to Boston University, where I majored in fine art.
What made you decide to switch to fine art from graphic art?
That's a good question. I wanted fine art. Well, actually, originally I wanted fashion design. My major in high school was fashion design, because that was the only class in my high school that had live models. Plus, I was a young man, and that's the class that had all the girls in it. So my major was fashion design. So I actually applied to FIT and Parsons, all those schools, and got accepted. But my family, I know you're recording this, I have to hesitate what I say. But I'll be honest, at this moment, homophobia made my family suggest that I go to a different school and not major in fashion design. In the 60s, that was a big thing, So I went to SVA and majored in graphic design because they also felt that if I wanted to make a living while I was alive, I need to be in graphic design.
A typical artist story, right?
Yeah. So that's why I did graphic design. But when I went to BU, I don't know. My interest I always was interested in all the arts, like theater, music, writing, as well as visual arts. So at BU, I was focused on all the arts, even though my major was fine art. I was very involved in the theater department.
And writing, too, isn't that correct?
Yes. Well, again, at BU, I wrote lots of plays that were performed on campus. And in Newark, in the 60s, there was a program, national program called Model Cities Program, I think it was called. And in that program, my high school partnered with Rutgers University. So Rutgers University offered playwriting, dance, and acting and directing to high school kids. So even though I was an art major and music major in high school, I was studying acting and directing at Rutgers University at the same time for 4 years, and playwriting. So my interests were very expanded by the time I got to BU. So I tried to do everything.
And then we included this because this was very important to you, I think, in your development. Could you tell us what we're looking at? Yes,
this is a picture of Amiri Baraka, a world-famous poet. And he had an organization called the Committee for Unified Newark. And it started in the 60s, probably after the riots, but I became aware of it in 1968. And it was really the doorway to self-awareness for African Americans in the city of Newark. Because prior to the riots in Newark, there was no real political organization or movement among the people of any race, as far as I'm aware. But after the riots, his organization really became pivotal for self-awareness, where people suddenly were dropping what they called their slave names, having African names. When we see each other on the street, we no longer said hello, we said habari gani, which was a Swahili greeting. And he offered lots of theater classes, and this image here shows a dance class, the boot dancers, kind of the South African boot dance. They traveled all over the country, but they started in Newark. And so the fact that he was a free-thinking black man and he was an artist, he became a big inspiration to me as a kid. And
after you graduated from BU, where did you go?
Back to Newark? The Art Students League in New York.
Oh, in New York, yes.
Yeah, I did.
Were you still living in Newark?
I did live in Newark, but I attended anatomy and drawing classes at the Art Students League and began to work as a freelance graphic designer and illustrator all over the place.
And did you set up a studio at any point?
Yes, I had a studio in my apartment. I got out of school in '76. So my life has lots of incidents. So I can try to fill in, and I'll just start. '76, I graduated from school, and I began to work as a freelance designer and illustrator, mostly in New York and New Jersey, album covers, book jackets, a couple of political cartoons. But in 1978, I got offered a chance to be in a theater company in Delaware. So I moved to Newark, Delaware, and worked in the theater department there with a resident children's theater company for 1 year, traveling around doing plays and things like that. At '77, which I skipped, I went to California in '77 because I wanted to be a television writer. And my sister worked at NBC, so she got me a couple of interviews. So I spent 77 in Los Angeles and sold some paintings to an insurance company there. Didn't have any success as a writer, though. So I did a theater job in 78, and in 79, I lived in South Jersey. And again, I was just a freelance designer and illustrator. And I had a job pasting up the yellow pages for one day. I couldn't imagine doing it 8 hours every day. I worked for a hospice service, designing newsletters and audio graphics. And I came back to Newark around 79, and late 79, and I worked teaching art at a Job Corps training center, working with troubled youth. And at the same time, I was doing graphics for a TV station in Jersey. And those graphics got me an opportunity to learn computer graphics, which was a new thing in 79 and 80. So in 80, I started working for a company called National Slide Makers, where we did everything that you can do now on your home computer. But back then, it was a real specific skill. There was no Photoshop. I think Steve Jobs had come up with the Lisa, but IBM was still the major player in the computer industry. So we worked on IBM machines. We had a workstation that looked like the Starship Enterprise. Huge console, small screen, about the size of this screen. Our printer was called a deck writer, had a big roll of paper on the floor that would roll up in it. So I did that for 2 years, and during those 2 years, I lived in an apartment. But I left that job after 2 years, and I moved into, I moved into a loft 1 year before I left the job. And in that loft, the whole place was my studio, 3,000 square feet. And I was coming from being an illustrator and a designer on a small drawing board, but suddenly had all this space. So I started renting space to other artists. And then I turned half the space into a gallery. And little by little, it just all became my space.
Well, let's look at some of the artwork now. This was, I guess, your first major show.
Yes.
This installation. You want to tell us about it?
Yes. This, what year? That is 1988. So the anti-apartheid movement was really big in the U.S. And my space was called the Works Gallery. So in New Jersey, we were the center for art against apartheid. So that inspired me to make this piece, and it was called 10,000 Mandelas. And it came to me in a dream, and I couldn't imagine it really happening. My dream was to see everybody as Nelson Mandela. So I met this gentleman named Ted Davis, who was like a great organizer and a guy who really got things done, and he helped me to make it happen. We ended up with about 30 volunteers, and we had these cardboard cutouts of the human body with either arms out or in the rest position, and a Mandela's face on each cutout, and we numbered each one, and we put them all over Soho. And it was a beautiful experience. We had video crews. It was a great experience, but it was the first big idea for me, big project that actually happened. So it got the attention of Franklin Furnace Gallery, and they showed it there. So this is really the residue of it here. It actually showed in a couple other galleries too in New Jersey, but this was the one that got the most attention.
And then soon thereafter, you came up with an idea that led to quite a lot of work, the scorched iron.
Right. See, it's also a fact that artists do lots of different things, but the market picks up on certain things. So in 1989, I was offered the residency at the Student Museum in Harlem. It was a one-year residency. It gave me a weekly paycheck, which was good. And in my studio in Newark, I had been working on making clothing and what I call big minimalist paintings by weaving galvanized steel strips together. One of my neighbors in my building made air-conditioned ducts and things like that. So he was throwing away lots of strips of galvanized steel, 1 inch, 2 inch, and smaller, but 12 feet long. So free materials. So I collected those things and made a lot of stuff out of that. But when I got the opportunity to go to Harlem, I didn't want to carry that stuff with me. So I was looking for something else to do. I actually started with windshield wipers and trying to make chihuahuas out of windshield wipers, which I never did. But on the way to the studio one day, I saw an iron on the street that had been run over by a car. And to me, the iron looked a lot like a mask, specifically like a Dan mask from Liberia. So that opened my energy to irons. And somehow, and this is kind of crazy too, but I say open my energy to irons because irons just started to appear in my life everywhere. I didn't go out and buy irons, they were just there, you know. Maybe they didn't clean the city, I don't know, but there were lots of irons on the street. Then I realized every time there was a fire in the city, if I go to that location, I would find an iron, a telephone, and an ironing board, because I've made art of those two things as well. So my first pieces were like this piece here. They all had the names Presence and Evidence because the iron sculpture, which evolved to be dismantled iron reassembled from all the original parts. But in this particular one, which was the first one, only the head is an iron. The rest of the body is made from other found things. And I was very aware and inspired by African religion. I had a great friend who was a dealer of African art, so we talked about Africa, politics, and religion completely. And also in New York and New Jersey at the time, and probably even greater today, there were a lot of people who practiced either Akan or Yoruba religion. So I attended ceremonies and got a lot of awareness about these things as well. So the fact that I made the figures, they were in what I call power or spiritual poses. I wanted to show the evidence of their spiritual or power. And I realized the evidence of the power of the iron is in the scorch. Because you can look at an iron, but you don't have a sense. Of course, we know it gets hot, but we don't have a sense of its power until we plug it in and it gets hot. So that led to the scorches.
Another early found object work.
Yes.
How did this one come about?
Well, as I mentioned about the galvanized steel strips, free art materials. So about a block from my studio, there was a big factory that had been abandoned for many years. I remember seeing this factory when I was a kid from the projects. And as a little kid, I thought it was another country, but it was really just like a couple miles away. And that factory made hairdryers, but it had been abandoned for years. So I was making jewelry, taking classes at the North Museum, jewelry making classes, and making my jewelry out of rusty objects. So I'm walking down the street looking for rusty things to make jewelry with. And I come to this factory, and I don't really look up. I'm looking at the ground, picking up washers and nails, all kinds of things. I end up in this building, and I go up to the second floor, and I see a mountain of hairdryers, all blue and white. And it was just so beautiful like that.
And they had been abandoned, or what?
Yeah, the whole building had been empty. I mean, there were homeless people living in it, and the roof was leaking. There were animals in it. It was a whole very surreal kind of post-apocalyptic kind of building. So I took a cue from the homeless people, got myself a shopping cart, and within about 3 hours, I had every hairdryer from that building in my studio. And I started making these pieces after a trip to Mexico, and I was just kind of inspired by some of the art there to make faces like that. That's how it came about.
This, of course, is the work on loan from the Linda Pace Foundation, and this was actually the first, was it not?
This is the first scorch that did not have an iron figure in front of it. And
it has an iron embedded into it as well.
Yes, because if you look at that piece carefully, that iron was so hot that it was sticking to the canvas, and I would pull it up and move it around, but it was so hot I would drop it, and I would get the next scorch on there. So where the iron is there is where it ended up.
And tell us a little bit about the sort of the metaphoric associations with the iron, what that meant to you at the time.
Well, because the initial inspiration, or at least the initial catalyst for my perception, was to see the iron as an African mass. That the whole iron thing initially tied into African religion and culture. But sometime a few years before that, maybe like in '87, I took a trip to Nice to an art fair. and I saw an artist there whose name I don't recall. He was using not real, so-called real African art, but airport art. And he had one piece that was a seated African carving of a male with a wool hat on. And I don't know what it meant to him, because I never spoke to him about it, but that juxtaposition of something contemporary and something from the past, even though it was a newly made piece just for the tourist trade, made me want to find juxtapositions. So I took the word African American and I began to play with that word with the iron in mind. So I made a list of all the things that the iron made me think of. So of course the iron was first the iron, and I'm talking about 1960s irons with silver bottom and black handle. So I made a list. The second word on the list was black, which related to the people as well as the handle of the iron. Then I thought about who uses the iron, and that led me to not housewives, but servants. And servants led me to slaves, and slaves led me to slave ships. So it was just an endless list that yielded inspiration for years, and to this day it still does.
And as we'll see when we progress, list making and writing things down seems to be a continued resource for you as far as your inspiration.
Yeah, and partly because in screenwriting, you have to really be specific about your ideas. You don't just sit down page 1 and end up on page 120. You have to have outlines, and you really have to know every detail of your story. So the list making comes from just studying screenwriting and playwriting. And the writing in my art comes from before I was quote unquote Willie Cole. I did all kinds of things. I was a writer, I had a band, I was going to be the next Olympic marathon champion. Like most young people want to do everything. But once art making became not just my bread and butter, but my religion, I couldn't find the time to do these other things. So to get that time, I made those things part of my artwork. So that's how writing got into the work.
Someday you should write a book for artists just on, the importance of diligence and being true to your calling, which obviously
I'll do that.
You're a great
Can you suggest a title?
Be true to your school. I don't know,
Be true to your school. All right, I'll consider that.
But you're a great role model for younger artists, and I know we have some sitting in our audience.
Okay, I'll put that quote on the back cover of the book.
Okay, moving forward, more irons, but now a different approach.
Yeah. I had been inspired by figurative African art. I had a great friend, Lawrence Ramsey, was an art dealer, and he and I probably spent at least 3 hours every day together talking about art and about Africa. But his specialty was not the figure, but the mask. So I said, well, maybe I'll try to make just some heads for a while. So these pieces were very instant, like 1 hour play pieces, because my approach is a lot like play. It's like I got a new set of blocks or Tinker Toys, and I sit and play with them for a couple hours. So these pieces are evolved from that. And I do remember the one on the right was inspired by the Mende and their female secret societies where they have lots of rings around their neck. That's the one with the silver bottom.
Did Picasso enter into this at all? I'm just thinking about some of his...
No more than he did just from being an art student. Now I look at Picasso more as a role model in terms of creating a career. Because Picasso had many dealers. He didn't give out work on consignment like we have to do nowadays. The dealers would line up outside his studio with cash in hand to pay him for the work that they would then resell. So I look at that example. Haven't achieved that result, but I look at that example. But I have had an awareness, of course, from school of all of art history. But my inspiration for this work was not Picasso. It was really African art and tribal art.
Which also inspired Picasso.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
So that just means, which is another one of my things that may come up in this talk, is that every energy that ever existed on the planet is still here. We just have to be open to it, and it comes to us. So I share that with Picasso.
So now you put the iron scorches in sort of window boxes.
Right, they're in window boxes because, it's a household appliance. So the idea of home became important to the scorch work. And it was my dealer in New York who